And then right after that, I got orders to take and go to Palm Springs, rather Long Beach, California. And they were starting the Sixth Ferry Group there. And it had been Doherty Field, and there was lots of oil buildings around, real fancy oil buildings. They took those, the BOQs hadn't been put in, and so on. Well, anyway, I got sent out there, and there was a fellow by the name of Spake. He was full colonel. He knew my daddy fairly well. And I got in there, and he says, okay, you're technical air training. He said, you've got to set up the ground school and so on, and all of them. And I remember I did. I set that up, and Colonel Tunner, he was a colonel at the time, was actually our boss. He was in, and he would tell us what to do, and Spake including myself. And so I started that, and then we combined transition. And I remember there was he was a major at the time, Dick Morgan, and he was out of Wilmington, Delaware. He was an old military guy. I'd say he was probably 55 at the time, really a stern guy, but one hell of a pilot, civilian pilot. And he'd been on that Stinson deal out of Wilmington. And what he would do was, he would take the Stinsons and you fly down and pick up the mail, pick up the mail, sweep it and pull it back in. So he had a lot of flying. But he gave me my check ride in the C-47. And I remember he always said, he said, this is the cub of the Air Force. And one night later, I tried to say, well, Eastern does it a little bit different than you do it and so on and so on. He says, you're in the military now as a cub of the Air Force. I remember him always saying that. So anyhow, we went on from there.
I interviewed quite a few pilots from World War II, and most of them just fly one type of plane.
I flew everything in inventory. Really, I tell you, I should have paid them. Here's a kid right out of school and loved airplanes and to fly them all. And I'd flown about everything that was around. But to get into all of these different airplanes, it was fantastic. And what they would do was they'd send me to the factory and I'd get checked out on the model. And then I'd bring it in, I'd write the pilot's checklists and so on because they had theirs and so on. But I had a format that I had to follow. And I got to do that. In fact, I know I'm the oldest helicopter pilot because this would have been June of '43. We went to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and of course then they had the first Sikorskys. They had a 165 Warner in it, and everything was wood, of course, but they flew. And 5 of us went up there, and I'm the only one still flying. I still instruct in helicopters, so I know I'm the oldest. The P-59, I was on the first jet. That was, of course, Bell Aircraft up there and that, and then I went on to the P-80s and the T-33. And what happened was, I had permissive leave for a while. A lot of it was accrued right after World War II, and then I went back on in afterwards, and it was tremendous. And the military's been real good to me because, first of all, during World War II, I developed the high altitude pressure breathing. I was on the team. We developed that, and then later on, the pressure suit regulator. And of course, we were getting the anti-G suit regulator, I should say. We were getting the jets in and so on, and of course, the G loads you could pull were tremendous, and a lot of guys blacked out and so on. Now, the Russians, with their MiGs, they'd gone way beyond that MiG-15, and they had some pretty damn good aircraft, and they had good pilots, and they were good shots, but so were we. And so consequently, the big thing was whoever had the longest useful consciousness would obviously win, and this really helped. So I could take 4 Gs and actually cut it to 2 Gs. And I had a suit that was here. And a fellow named Earl Wood up in Mayo had developed pretty much the suit. And I ended up making the regulator. His suit was great. We modified it a little bit. But that was the anti-G suit. And we did real well with that for a while. I think it took the Russians 2.5 years to take and catch up with that. So that was kind of a fun project. Now, later on, I took what I had learned with the G suit, the magnetic clutches and so on. It was simple. And also my pressure rig. And I used parts out of each. And I created the civilian Mark 7 respirator, which became the standard all over the world. So if I hadn't had the military experience, and I had another advantage too. Now, I could have been a contractor, but I was in the military. I had to develop my prototypes off base like any contractor would. Then if the military wanted it, they would run the animal studies in medicine, run the animal studies and so on. Now, anything I developed was AN, I belonged to the military, but I had an exclusion. I remember I had a letter from a provost marshal and so on to allow me to do that. But it was a military option. In other words, if they wanted to evaluate, of course they did. And that allowed me, to this day, every ventilator I've ever developed, a respirator or any medical product, cardio, heart, lung, I was able to take it through, do all my animal studies and my original patient studies, and then, of course, go out. So that gave me a tremendous, tremendous advantage. So it was really good to me.
What rank did you end up with?
Colonel, yeah. Well, I was in a long time, you see, all the years.
How many years were you in there?
Well, I was called up actually on, as I said, December 14, 1941. And I was in and out, and 1983 I took my last ride, yeah. So that was down at Muroc or Edwards. Yeah.
Do you remember VE Day?
I absolutely remember VE Day. Now, right toward the end of VD Day, let's look at VD Day. VD Day, what happened was, probably, let's see, this would have been first, we were advised in March. We were going to take, we had the B-25 Gs and Hs, and they had the 75 millimeter cannon in the nose. We had 250 caliber on the same, and these were flying tanks. They really were. They were heavy as hell, but they were flying tanks. And we got orders that we were going to take and fly them over. We were going to get some gunnery practice. I'd not been a combat pilot at all. So we went out to Arizona, and we blowing stuff up they had planted on the desert. Christ, it was great. We had a lot of fun. And I forget, there was 2 crews. I think about 17 crews, and I think we had maybe 15 Gs and Hs mixed, but they were all armored and so on. But they had ILS systems in it. And runway 30 in Palm Springs, we had the first ILS system in the world, I guess, there. And I was familiar with it, and so were the other pilots, number of them. So all of us were familiar, and well, we were pretty good with the gauges. And we got to take them down there. And then we got orders to take them over to Hastings, England. And Hastings, England was a steel mat runway in southern England. And it was just made in the boonies out there, and it had an ILS system in it. So we got over there, I think in May, if I remember, early May. And we were taught we'd come right down head on the railroad, and they put a 75 millimeter in that boiler, and boom, of course. And then you have to pull up so the debris so you wouldn't get hit. And we did that. Oh, I don't know how many times. It kind of was fun. And to begin with, we had you had to load manually down there. The 50 caliber just had belts, but the other one, the 75, was manually loaded. And we had just had a bench seat on the side. We really didn't have a full control on these airplanes because you had to get down into the nose easy on it. So consequently, we had P-47 drivers that had actually been in combat. Well, Jesus, Christ, here are these guys in combat, and we hadn't had any other than down there, and they didn't like us worth a damn thing. And I remember, boy, they were quite. But the first ILS, boy, we took them in on. They found out why we were sitting on the left and while we were sitting there, and especially coming home. So what we do, we run there and we come back over Dunkirk, and then we come back and go down to Hastings. And usually I made an ILS coming in. But if anybody got after you, just pull up into the clouds. So it worked out real well. And the last day that I flew, in fact, was pretty, this weather we had, it was patchy clouds and so on, and that was VD Day. Now, we knew nothing about it, and the only difference was that day we flew up the coast, and I think we got 2 locomotives. Christ, everything was busy that day. And we saw, we could see down and see stuff down, and of course we were underneath, and then we could see down through the cloud. Well, anyhow, I forget, I think we got a locomotive that day on the way up the coast. But going out through Dunkirk, my left waistman back there, we got some small arms fire out on the wing. I didn't even feel it or anything. If they hadn't seen it, I wouldn't know it. Well, anyhow, we went back and, of course, landed at Hastings. And everybody came around. Now, tell us about the invasions. Tell about the invasion. Hell, we didn't know the first thing about it. Really didn't. And then I had to put my airplane on a diagonal. And they got in there and they grounded my airplane. Well, that was the end of my time over there. So I was sent and then came back home for the rest of the war was in the Pacific. Yeah.
So you actually got, because you were able to fly so many planes, you got sort of a PhD in flying in a way.
Well, we call it Class 5P. In other words, if you were a 5P pilot, you could fly any fighter or bomber or transport and so on. But really we did. And it was just so tremendous. I learned so much about those airplanes. And we had a real good transition and so on in there. And we turned out a lot of good. And the biggest thing, we used every civilian pilot we could get that had any amount of time. And the military pilots, of course, they used every one of them. Now, during the early days of the war, these guys, you remember, they had 250 hours. Hell, they were sitting in the left seat out bombing. And we would take the airplanes, and those of us who were instrument, we would ferry them over. And we've like the B-17s, they would be made in Long Beach. We take them to Savannah, and they put the armament on in Savannah, and then we take them across. And they were short on fuel. God, we had to take and do this. And but then when we got fuel, Bluey West 1 was Greenland. We used to take and go in there. We could take and go to Savannah, usually up to Goose or Gander and out of there. And then if the fuel, we went to Reykjavik. And of course the Irish, we couldn't land there, so we went into Prestwick, Scotland. It was a little north, but we did that, and of course then it was fine. But then later on we started to get the Tokyo tanks and so on, the long range. So boy, that made a big difference.